When my son died, everything was handed to his wife. The house, $35 million, the future he once promised me I would be part of. She told me my place was gone, that I had no right to stay. I left quietly, carrying grief and shame like stones in my chest. But 5 days later, the lawyer called me in. With a smirk, he asked if she had really listened carefully to the will. What he read made her face drained of color and fainted in her chair. If you want to see how this plays out, please hit the like button and consider subscribing. Preston's funeral took place at Riverside Memorial on a Tuesday morning in late October. The cemetery gates creaked as they opened, a sound that seemed to echo the grinding in my chest. The autumn leaves fell like tears from the maples lining the cemetery path, carpeting the ground in browns and golds that crunched under mourners' feet. The morning air carried a bite that made everyone pull their coats tighter, though the cold I felt went deeper than weather could reach. I sat in the front row on a metal folding chair that pressed hard against my spine, my hands trembling not from the temperature, but from the weight of knowing my boy was gone at 38. Marlene sat beside me, her shoulders shaking with what looked like grief. She dabbed at her eyes with a white handkerchief, careful movements that seemed almost rehearsed, like she'd practiced in front of a mirror. The mascara never ran, never smudged, even as tears rolled down her cheeks. I noticed because focusing on small details kept me from screaming at the impossibility of my son being in that box. She'd chosen waterproof makeup for her husband's funeral, and something about that deliberate choice made my stomach turn. The fabric of her black dress was expensive, the kind that didn't wrinkle even after sitting for an hour, and she kept smoothing it over her knees anyway, fingers moving in nervous patterns that didn't match the stillness of her face. 300 people came to say goodbye to Preston, filling the rows of chairs and standing in clusters at the back. He'd been the kind of man who remembered birthdays and helped neighbors move furniture without being asked, who knew the names of every cashier at the local grocery store. The funeral director had to bring extra chairs from storage, setting them up quietly while people filed in. I recognized faces from every part of Preston's life, from his childhood friends with graying hair to young colleagues from the software company who looked lost and confused, unable to process how someone their age could just stop existing. The smell of lilies hung heavy in the air, that sick, sweet funeral flower scent that would forever remind me of this day. It mixed with something expensive and floral that wasn't the lavender scent Marlene had worn for years, something new and aggressive that seemed to push against the traditional funeral atmosphere. Women dabbed at their eyes with tissues, while men stood stiffly, hands clasped in front of them, everyone maintaining that careful funeral quiet, where even breathing seemed too loud. The pastor spoke about Preston's generous heart, while Marlene gripped my hand, her nails pressing crescents into my palm that would leave marks for days. Her grip tightened whenever someone mentioned Preston's kindness to family. And later, I would wonder if she was holding on to me, or holding me in place. The October sun broke through clouds at strange moments, sending shafts of light through the tent that had been erected over the graveside, lighting up the coffin's brass handles like accusations nobody else could see. 3 days after we put my son in the ground, after the last casserole had been delivered and the last sympathy card had arrived, Garrett called about the will. His voice on the phone was professionally gentle, the way people talk when they're about to rearrange your life. His office sat on the 4th floor of a building downtown, all dark wood and leather chairs that creaked when you shifted your weight. The elevator ride up felt endless, my reflection in the polished doors showing an old man I barely recognized, someone who'd aged a decade in a week. The hallway to his office smelled like coffee and copy paper, normal scents that seemed bizarre when nothing about my life was normal anymore. Marlene arrived 15 minutes late, wearing a black suit that looked fresh from the store, the tags probably snipped off that morning. Her heels clicked against the marble floor with a confidence that seemed out of place for a grieving widow. She settled into the chair next to mine, crossing her legs and placing her designer purse carefully on the floor where everyone could see the logo. The leather was so new it still smelled like the store, and she touched it occasionally like she was making sure it was still there. The reading proceeded as expected at first. Garrett's voice rolled through the legal language like water over rocks, smooth and inevitable. The house in Willowbrook, valued at $800,000. The investment portfolio, worth $12 million. The savings accounts, another $23 million from Preston's software company buyout. All of it going to Marlene. Her eyes lit up with each asset named, though she tried to hide it behind that handkerchief, the same white one from the funeral that she'd apparently decided was her prop for grief. Her breathing changed with each million mentioned, getting shallower and faster like someone watching lottery numbers match their ticket. Garrett paused halfway through, reaching for his water glass with fingers that seemed to hesitate over the papers. He coughed slightly, muttered something about October allergies, then continued reading. His voice stayed steady and professional, while Marlene leaned forward slightly, absorbing every word like a student memorizing answers for a test she'd been waiting her whole life to take. I remembered Preston's promise from 6 months ago, grilling steaks in the backyard while smoke drifted between us. His voice casual but firm, telling me I'd always have a home with them. The memory stung worse than any physical pain I'd ever endured on construction sites. Worse than the metal rod that had gone through my shoulder. Worse than the 3 surgeries that followed. That evening, everything changed with the suddenness of a door slamming. I was in Preston's old room folding the few clothes I'd accumulated since moving in, the familiar smell of his childhood still lingering in the corners. The room had barely changed since high school. Still had the baseball trophies on the shelf, and the dent in the wall from when he'd tried to learn guitar. Marlene appeared in the doorway, like a shadow taking form. Her face was different now, harder somehow, as if she'd taken off a mask she'd been wearing since Preston died. The soft edges from the funeral were gone, replaced by something sharp and calculating that made me step back instinctively. "Pack your things. You're not welcome here anymore," she said, her voice flat as weak soda, no fizz or life left in it. When I reminded her of Preston's promise, the words came out cracked and desperate, an old man pleading for basic decency. She laughed then, a sound like glass breaking in an empty room, sharp and startling and wrong. "Preston's dead. His promises died with him. Go die in a dumpster for all I care." The words hung in the air between us, and I could see she meant them, every syllable calculated to cut. She stood there tapping her manicured nails against the doorframe, each tap marking time like a countdown to my eviction. The rhythm followed me as I packed, echoing in my head even after she'd walked away to make phone calls about renovation plans. My hands shook as I folded my shirts, these old man clothes that looked pathetic in Preston's childhood room. My eyes fell on the ashwood box sitting on the shelf, the one Preston had made in 7th grade shop class. Inside were photographs from better times, his Little League medals that still gleamed despite the years, a Father's Day card from when he was 10 that said, "World's Best Dad," in his crooked handwriting. I wrapped it carefully in an old sweater that still smelled faintly of Preston's cologne, and placed it in my suitcase with the reverence of someone handling religious relics. The house felt different as I walked through it one last time. Like it knew Preston was gone, and I was being forced out. Like the walls themselves were already forgetting we'd ever been a family here. The walls we'd painted together when he was 16 seemed to lean away from me. The kitchen where we'd shared countless morning coffees sat empty and accusing. As I reached the front door, my phone buzzed. A text from Garrett glowed on the screen, just 3 words that changed everything. "Call me. Urgent." The morning Marlene threw me out started with the rumble of a moving truck in the driveway, the diesel engine rattling the windows in their frames. 2 guys and a truck, though she hadn't hired them to move anything in, just to stand there like witnesses while she watched me leave. October 28th, 7 in the morning. The grass still wet with dew that soaked through my worn sneakers as I carried boxes to the curb. The autumn air bit at my face, carrying the smell of dying leaves and something else, the scent of endings that October always brings. My back screamed from a night on the thin mattress she'd moved into Preston's room, replacing his memory foam one while I was at the funeral home making arrangements. Every movement sent lightning up my spine, reminders of the construction accident that had ended my career and brought me to live here in the first place. She stood in the hallway, wearing a new silk robe I'd never seen before, burgundy with gold trim that caught the morning light streaming through the windows. The fabric whispered against itself when she moved, a sound like secrets being told. She was tapping her foot against the hardwood floor Preston and I had installed together 5 summers ago, when he was still healthy, and we'd spent a whole weekend on our knees, fitting each plank perfectly. The rhythm of her tapping matched my heartbeat, both too fast, both counting down to something irreversible. Her hair was already styled, makeup already applied at this early hour, like she'd been up for hours preparing for this performance of eviction. Marlene supervised my packing like a prison guard, counting each item I touched with eyes that had turned cold as winter glass. She'd already changed the smell of the place, replacing Preston's coffee and old books scent with expensive candles that made everything smell like a high-end department store, artificial and suffocating. The house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to leave so it could exhale and forget I'd ever lived there. Her eyes followed my hands as I folded shirts that had seen better days, packed medications in their white bottles, gathered the few possessions that marked my presence in what had been my son's home. The movers stood by the door, 2 young men who kept checking their phones and avoiding eye contact, clearly uncomfortable with whatever scene they'd been hired to witness. When I reached for Preston's old baseball glove from the hall closet, the leather cracked and worn from years of backyard catches, she stepped forward with a sharp intake of breath, her hand half raised like she might snatch it from me, then seemed to reconsider, probably calculating how it would look to the movers if she grabbed a dead man's childhood toy from his grieving father. The glove still smelled faintly of leather oil and summer grass, and holding it brought back 1,000 memories of teaching Preston to catch, his small hands lost in the too big glove, his face serious with concentration. I wrapped it carefully in newspaper, the headlines talking about stock markets and elections, things that seemed impossibly trivial now. That's when Nadine arrived, her car pulling up with a screech of brakes that announced her urgency. My daughter had driven 2 hours from Springfield after my text the night before. A message I'd sent with shaking fingers that just said, "She's making me leave." The shock on her face when she saw the moving truck made my chest tight, with a mixture of shame and relief that someone else would witness this cruelty. She pushed past the movers without apology, her nurse's scrubs still wrinkled from her night shift at the hospital. There were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide, and her hair was pulled back in the messy bun she always wore when she was too tired to care about appearances. She smelled like hospital disinfectant and exhaustion, a combination I recognized from all the times she'd come straight from work to visit Preston in his final weeks. The confrontation between her and Marlene happened right there in the foyer. Under the chandelier, Preston had surprised Marlene with on their 5th anniversary. Nadine's voice cracked with exhaustion and rage as she demanded to know how Marlene could do this, how she could throw out the man who'd built this house with his bare hands, who'd laid every tile in the bathroom, who'd spent his retirement savings to help with the down payment. Her words echoed off the walls, filling the space with the kind of truth that makes people uncomfortable. Marlene's response came cold and clinical, like she was reciting terms and conditions from a contract. The deed was in her name now. The decisions were hers to make. Preston hadn't left any legal provision for his father's residence. Each word was chosen for its legal precision. empty of any human warmth. She stood there in her silk robe like some queen dismissing peasants, the morning light from the window behind her creating a halo effect that seemed grotesquely inappropriate. She was unmoved by Nadine's tears, which were flowing freely now, or by my silence, which felt heavier than any words I could have spoken. The movers shifted awkwardly by the door, probably wishing they'd taken a different job this morning. One of them, a kid who couldn't have been older than 25 with tattoos creeping up his neck, kept looking at me with pity in his eyes, the kind of look you give to wounded animals. The other mover studied his clipboard intently, pretending to read whatever was written there over and over again. Nadine was still arguing, her voice rising and falling like waves, bringing up family obligations and moral responsibilities and basic human decency. But Marlene had already turned away, her robe swishing dramatically as she headed toward the kitchen. I could hear her in there, pouring coffee from the expensive machine Preston had bought her last Christmas, the one he'd researched for weeks to make sure he got exactly the right model. The sound of the coffee maker's hiss and gurgle felt like mockery, normal morning sounds in a situation that was anything but normal. The smell of fresh coffee drifted out, mixing with the candle scent, and creating something that made my stomach turn. The Super 8 Motel on Highway 12 became my new address that afternoon, after the longest drive of my life, even though it was only 15 minutes away. The neon sign flickered erratically, the E in 8 only working intermittently. $79 a night. Paid in cash because I didn't want to see the charges adding up on my credit card statement, each one a reminder of my displacement. The room smelled like industrial disinfectant trying to cover something worse, maybe decades of cigarette smoke, or the accumulated sadness of all the people who'd stayed here when their lives fell apart. The carpet was a brown that might have once been beige, worn thin in a path from the door to the bed to the bathroom, the ghost of countless temporary residents who'd paced this same route. I set the ash wood box on the scarred dresser, its surface marked with ring stains from years of coffee cups and beer bottles from previous occupants. Opening it carefully to check everything had survived the move, I found Preston's photo smiling up at me, frozen in better times when we still believed in forever. There was one from his 10th birthday, chocolate cake smeared on his face, another from high school graduation where he looked so serious and grown up, and one from last Christmas that now felt like a lifetime ago. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper that crinkled like autumn leaves, was a USB drive he'd handed me months back while we were cleaning out the garage together. "Just old tax returns," he'd said, tossing it into the box like it was nothing important. But something in his eyes had flickered, just for a moment, something I should have paid attention to. I sat on the bed, springs creaking under my weight, trying to make sense of the last week. 7 days ago, Preston had been alive, probably sitting at his desk working on code. Now he was in the ground, and his wife had wasted no time erasing his family from her life. The afternoon sun filtered through thin curtains, casting everything in sickly yellow light. I thought about calling Nadine, but her apartment was barely big enough for her and her daughter Sophie. Meanwhile, back at the house, Marlene was apparently wasting no time with renovations. The neighbor from next door called that evening to check if I was all right. She mentioned that Marlene had already been talking about repainting Preston's office. She'd also seen workers there earlier in the week, including someone from the city who'd been coming by regularly. "Must be updating the whole system," the neighbor said. "That fellow was there 3 times last week alone, always when Preston was at work." The motel room felt smaller as night fell. I'd unpacked my medications, lining them up on the bathroom counter like soldiers. Blood pressure, cholesterol, pain pills for my back that I tried not to take unless necessary. Each bottle reminded me of my age, my limitations, my dependence on others now. Preston had insisted I move in after the surgery, said it would be good for everyone. Marlene had smiled and nodded then, playing the devoted wife perfectly. I tried to sleep but kept seeing Preston's face from that last morning. He'd looked tired, stressed about something he wouldn't discuss. He'd hugged me longer than usual and told me to make sure Nadine got his baseball card collection if anything happened. I'd laughed it off, told him not to be morbid. Now that memory felt weighted with significance I'd missed. My phone rang just after midnight. Garrett's voice was carefully neutral. "Can you come to my office tomorrow at 10? Bring anything Preston gave you for safekeeping." After he hung up, I lay in the dark, listening to the motel sounds. Ice machines humming, doors slamming, televisions murmuring through thin walls. Somewhere in this city, Marlene was sleeping in the bed she'd shared with my son, probably already planning what to do with her millions. The USB drive sat in the ash wood box, looking like nothing more than old tax files, waiting to reveal whatever Preston had hidden inside. The morning I met with Garrett, October sky threatened rain. His office building looked more imposing in daylight, all glass and steel reaching toward gray clouds. The elevator ride to the 4th floor felt endless. Grief had carved new lines into my face, or maybe they'd been there all along. The ashwood box sat heavy in my hands, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag to protect it from the coming rain. Garrett's secretary offered me coffee while I waited. The mug warmed my hands, which had been cold since leaving the motel. Through the office windows, I could see the city Preston had loved, the skyline he'd photographed from dozens of angles. Garrett appeared exactly at 10, ushering me into his office with gravity that made my stomach clench. He closed the door carefully, checked it was properly latched, then turned to face me. He sat behind his desk and studied me before speaking. His questions came carefully, like feeling through a minefield. Had Preston ever talked about contingencies? Had he mentioned concerns about his health or marriage? Did I notice changes in his behavior over the last 6 months? Each question circled around something Garrett couldn't say directly. When I mentioned Preston's comment about his baseball cards for Nadine, Garrett's eyes sharpened. He made a note on his legal pad. Then Garrett reached into his drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope with Preston's handwriting. The instructions were clear, but cryptic. The paper looked official, notarized, dated 3 weeks before Preston died. Garrett explained that Preston had visited him 3 times in his final month, each visit more urgent than the last. The first time seemed like standard revisions. The second visit was different. Preston arriving without appointment, insisting on additional documents. The third visit had been 5 days before his death. During that final visit, Preston had been agitated in a way Garrett had never seen. He'd insisted on recording everything, having multiple copies made, setting up what he called a fail-safe. Preston had smiled that sad smile and said he was just being careful, wanted to make sure the people he loved were protected. Now, sitting in this office with rain beginning to tap against windows, Garrett's retelling made my chest tight with pride and sorrow. I remembered that strange month before Preston died. He'd seemed distracted, jumpy even. He'd started working from home more often, claiming he could concentrate better. Once, I'd walked into his office to bring lunch and found him quickly closing his laptop. When asked what was wrong, he'd brushed it off, said quarterly reports were brutal. But Preston had thrived on stress his whole life, had always risen to challenges rather than shrinking from them. The coffee had gone cold in my hands, but I kept holding the mug anyway. Garrett was explaining legal complexities of Preston's will, how there were layers that hadn't been revealed during the initial reading. Marlene had heard what she'd expected to hear, but there was more. There was always more with Preston, who'd been playing chess while everyone else played checkers since he was 12. Garrett pulled out another document, thicker, bound with a black clip. He didn't open it yet, just let it sit on the desk between us. I met Nadine at a coffee shop that afternoon, the one on 3rd Street where Preston used to buy his overpriced lattes. She looked exhausted from another night shift, but had insisted on meeting after my text about Garrett's summons. The shop was crowded with lunch rush, the noise of espresso machines and chatter providing cover. Nadine had been crying. I could tell from the puffiness makeup couldn't hide. She told me Marlene had already changed all the locks, installed a new security system, even replaced the doorbell camera. The speed felt deliberate, calculated. Nadine remembered things I'd forgotten. How Marlene had insisted on Preston getting more life insurance last year, pushing him to increase the policy to $5 million. How she'd suddenly become interested in Preston's work, asking about company valuation and stock options. How she'd started redecorating even before Preston got sick, buying expensive furniture on credit cards she assumed would be paid off eventually. Preston had confided once that his wife's spending worried him, but he loved her too much to deny her anything. The neighbor called while Nadine and I were still talking. She'd been walking her dog that morning and had seen Marlene with the repair person again, the expensive one from the city. They'd been standing very close on the front porch, closer than seemed professional. This time, Marlene had touched his arm, a familiar gesture. The van had been parked there for 3 hours, which seemed excessive for whatever work needed doing in a house Preston had meticulously maintained. That evening, alone in my motel room, I decided to check the USB drive Preston had given me. My old laptop took forever to boot up, wheezing like it shared my exhaustion. The drive contained a single folder labeled with last year's date, just as Preston had said, old tax files. But when I tried to open it, a password prompt appeared. I tried the obvious ones first. Preston's birthday, his anniversary. Nothing worked. Then I remembered how Preston used to hide things using mundane covers. His diary disguised as a math textbook, savings hidden in an old cereal box. I spent an hour trying different passwords. Outside, rain turned into steady downpour, drumming against the window. The motel's neon sign flickered and buzzed, casting strange shadows. Finally, I tried the date of my wedding anniversary with Preston's mother, the woman who'd died when he was just 15. The screen changed, the folder opening to reveal not tax documents, but a video file dated September 15th, 2 weeks before Preston died. My hands shook as I moved the cursor to click play. Before I could open it, my phone buzzed with a text from Marlene. Short, threatening in its simplicity. "Stop snooping around or you'll regret it." My blood ran cold. How did she know about my meeting with Garrett? I looked at the video file again, cursor hovering over it. Whatever Preston had hidden here, protected with our most sacred family date, would have to wait until morning. Tonight, I needed to think, to plan. The USB's small red light blinked in the darkness like a heartbeat, holding secrets that would change everything. The morning I finally watched Preston's video, my hands shook so badly I could barely click the mouse. The motel room was cold, the ancient heating unit coughing and sputtering. Outside, October rain had turned to sleet, tapping against the window in irregular rhythm. I'd been awake since 4, staring at that video file, knowing once I opened it, there would be no going back. The timestamp showed 11:43 at night. Preston's face appeared on screen, lit only by his computer monitor. Shadows carved hollows under his eyes I'd never noticed in life. He looked directly at the camera, and for a moment I forgot he was gone. "Dad, if you're watching this, something happened to me, and I need you to know the truth about Marlene." He paused, running his hand through his hair the way he always did when stressed. I found myself reaching toward the screen as if I could somehow comfort him across time and death. What came next shattered everything I thought I knew about my son's marriage. Preston had discovered Marlene's affair 6 months ago through something as mundane as a credit card statement. She'd been careless, charging a hotel room on a Tuesday afternoon when she'd told Preston she was at a medical conference in Boston. Except the charge was local, at the downtown Marriott, and the conference had been canceled weeks before. Preston's voice remained steady as he explained how he'd investigated quietly, thoroughly, gathering evidence piece by piece. The other man worked at the same hospital where Marlene was a nurse, in the cardiac unit where they'd had plenty of opportunities to grow close. Preston had photos on his phone. Screenshots of text messages Marlene thought she'd deleted. Credit card records showing expensive dinners at restaurants she'd never mentioned. He'd followed her once, just to be sure, and had seen them together at a cafe across town, the man's hand covering hers across the table, both laughing at something on his phone. But Preston hadn't confronted her. Instead, he'd done something that made me proud and terrified equally. He'd started documenting everything, not for divorce proceedings, but for something more complex. He'd discovered Marlene had been slowly poisoning him, not enough to kill quickly, but enough to weaken his heart. The sleeping pills she'd been giving him, supposedly prescribed by her friend at the hospital, were 3 times the normal dose. Combined with blood pressure medication she'd convinced him he needed, despite his numbers being normal, it was creating dangerous strain on his cardiovascular system. Preston had taken the pills to a private lab, had results verified twice, even consulted with a cardiologist in another city who'd confirmed his suspicions. The video continued for another 20 minutes. Preston laying out dates, times, evidence with methodical precision that made him such a good programmer. He'd changed his will, he explained, but in a way Marlene wouldn't expect. On the surface, she would inherit everything, just as she'd planned. But there were conditions hidden in legal language, requirements that would only be revealed if she showed her true nature. The first test would be whether she'd let me stay in the house. Preston knew she wouldn't. Knew her greed and cruelty would surface the moment he was gone. When she failed that test, when she threw me out like garbage, the rest of the conditions would activate like dominoes falling. "I'm not afraid of dying, Dad," Preston said near the end, and I had to pause it, unable to see through tears. When I continued, his voice was stronger. "But I won't let her win. I won't let her profit from destroying our family. Everything he'd built, everything he'd saved, wasn't for her. It was for me and Nadine, and for helping other families avoid what we were going through. The Preston Memorial Foundation for Elderly Care already existed, set up 2 months ago. If Marlene failed the conditions of the will, everything would transfer there automatically." He smiled then, that crooked smile from when he was 10 and had successfully pranked his sister. "Garrett has all the documents. Trust him. Only him." After the video ended, I sat in that dim motel room feeling like the world had shifted. My son had known he was being murdered and spent his final months not trying to save himself, but trying to protect others and ensure justice. The construction worker in me wanted to tear something apart with my bare hands. The father in me just wanted to hold my boy one more time, to tell him how brave he was, how proud I was, how sorry I was that I hadn't seen what was happening under my own roof. Garrett called an hour later, his timing too perfect to be coincidental. He asked if I'd reviewed the materials Preston had left me, speaking in that careful lawyer way that assumed phone lines might not be private. When I confirmed, he said we needed to meet immediately. Not at his office, but at a conference room he'd rented downtown. He gave specific instructions about arriving separately, using the parking garage, taking the service elevator. It felt like something from a movie. But then everything about the last week had felt surreal. The conference room was sterile and corporate, long table and uncomfortable chairs. Garrett was already there when I arrived, along with a woman I didn't recognize who turned out to be a private investigator he'd hired on Preston's behalf. She had a folder thick with photographs, documents, evidence that corroborated everything Preston had discovered, and more. The photos of Marlene with the other man were damning, but what made my stomach turn were pharmacy records showing Marlene's repeated purchases of sleeping aids and heart medications using her hospital credentials. Garrett explained the next steps with calm precision. Tomorrow would be the second reading of the will, what he called the full disclosure session. Marlene would be required to attend, and this time she would hear everything Preston had really written. The beauty of Preston's plan was that Marlene had already violated the primary condition by evicting me from the house. She'd had 72 hours to offer me residence and support. Instead, she'd thrown me out within 24. That single action had triggered consequences she couldn't imagine. Preston had insisted on video recording the will reading, had specified it should be done in a public setting with witnesses present. He'd even suggested inviting certain people who should see Marlene's true nature revealed. The guest list included her colleagues from the hospital, neighbors who'd known Preston since childhood, and most importantly, the other man, who would receive a special invitation that wouldn't reveal the true purpose. It was cruel, perhaps, but also brilliant. Preston had designed a scenario where Marlene's humiliation would be complete, public, and legally documented. As we prepared to leave, Garrett handed me another envelope marked with Preston's handwriting. Open only when Marlene is present. Inside was Preston's final message to his wife, the words he'd wanted her to hear when everything came crashing down. I tucked it into the ashwood box. Another piece of my son's careful revenge. The rain had stopped by the time I reached the parking garage. Weak October sunlight breaking through clouds like a promise. Tomorrow, Marlene would learn what happened when you destroyed a good man who'd loved you. The morning of the second will reading arrived wrapped in fog so thick I could barely see across the motel parking lot. October 31st, Halloween. Though the only horror story that mattered was about to unfold in a conference room downtown. I dressed carefully in the only suit I owned, the one from Preston's funeral, and packed the ashwood box with all the evidence into a briefcase Nadine had brought me. My hands were steady now, trembling replaced by cold determination Preston would have recognized. The conference room had been transformed since yesterday. Garrett had arranged chairs theater-style, facing a long table where he would preside over the destruction of Marlene's carefully constructed new life. A court reporter sat in the corner, fingers poised over her stenograph machine. 2 cameras were mounted on tripods, one facing the table, one capturing the audience area. Everything would be recorded, witnessed, and undeniable. Preston had thought of everything, even specifying in his will that the reading must be filmed. People began arriving at 9:30 for the 10 o'clock reading. The neighbor came first, clutching her purse and looking confused but curious. Then came 3 of Preston's colleagues from the software company, men who'd worked beside him for years. Several nurses from the hospital arrived together, whispering among themselves. Each person who entered added another layer of witnesses to what was about to happen, another set of eyes that would see Marlene exposed. Nadine arrived with her daughter Sophie. My granddaughter's presence a surprise, until I remembered Preston's specific instruction that the entire family should witness this moment. Sophie, just 16, had adored her Uncle Preston. Her eyes were still red from crying. She hugged me tightly before taking her seat, whispering that she missed him, that nothing felt right without him. I held her close for a moment, breathing in her strawberry shampoo, remembering when Preston had been that young, that innocent. Marlene entered at exactly 10 o'clock, fashionably on time for her own destruction. She wore a new black dress that probably cost more than my monthly motel bill, designer heels clicking against the floor like a countdown. The confidence in her stride faltered when she saw the crowd, the cameras, the formal setup. Her eyes found mine across the room, and for just a moment I saw fear flicker before she masked it with indignation. She started to protest, but Garrett raised his hand for silence. The real shock came when the other man walked in 5 minutes late, looking confused and uncomfortable in an ill-fitting suit. Marlene's face went white as paper, then flushed red. He tried to catch her eye, but she stared straight ahead, hands clenched so tightly her knuckles looked like bone pushing through skin. He took a seat in the back row, far from her, probably already calculating how to distance himself. The tension was thick enough to cut, everyone sensing this was no ordinary will reading. Garrett began with the same preamble as before, reading through the distribution of assets. $35 million, the house, the investments. Marlene relaxed slightly, probably thinking this was just formality. But then Garrett paused, took a sip of water, and continued in that same measured tone. However, all distributions are contingent upon the following conditions being met in full. The words hung in the air like a sword about to fall. Marlene's head snapped up. Condition 1, Garrett read, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. The beneficiary must provide suitable residence and care for my father for a minimum of 5 years from the date of my death. This condition is considered violated if my father is asked to leave, forced to relocate, or made to feel unwelcome within 72 hours of the will's initial reading. He paused, letting words sink in. According to documented evidence, including doorbell camera footage, the beneficiary removed my father within 24 hours. Gasps rippled through the room. The neighbor's hand flew to her mouth. The nurses exchanged shocked glances. Sophie started crying quietly, and Nadine pulled her close. Marlene sat frozen, mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. She tried to speak, to protest, but Garrett continued reading, his voice never wavering. Each word was another nail in the coffin of her expectations, another revelation of how thoroughly Preston had anticipated her cruelty. Condition 2, Garrett continued, and I could see Marlene shrinking in her chair. The beneficiary must demonstrate moral character consistent with values Preston held dear, including fidelity, honesty, and compassion. Evidence of infidelity, deception, or cruelty will result in immediate forfeiture of all inherited assets. He looked up from the document. We have substantial evidence documenting a 6-month extramarital affair conducted while Preston was alive and being systematically poisoned with excessive doses of sleeping medication. The room erupted. The other man shot to his feet, face cycling through confusion, anger, and fear. The hospital nurses were whispering frantically, probably calculating professional implications for Marlene's medical license. The neighbor was openly crying now. Through it all, Marlene sat perfectly still, like she'd been turned to stone. The designer dress, the expensive jewelry, all of it now looked like costume pieces on someone playing a role they'd just been fired from. Garrett waited for the room to quiet before delivering the final blow. Due to violation of these conditions, all assets previously designated for the beneficiary will be transferred immediately to the Preston Memorial Foundation for Elderly Care, a non-profit organization established by Preston 2 months before his death. He set down the papers and looked directly at Marlene. The transfer is effective immediately. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises. This is fake! Marlene's voice cracked as she finally found her words. But Garrett was ready. He pulled out his laptop, connected it to a projector, and the screen froze on Preston's face, sitting in this very law office, about to read these exact conditions aloud. The video of Preston reading his will conditions played on the projector screen, his face larger than life on the white wall, and for a moment it felt like he was there with us, delivering his own justice from beyond the grave. His voice filled the conference room with calm authority that I recognized from when he'd explain complex problems, breaking them down into pieces anyone could understand. The projector hummed softly, its fan working hard to keep the bulb cool, and the light cast strange shadows across Marlene's face as she watched her dead husband destroy her future. The timestamp in the corner showed 3 weeks before his death, when he'd already known what she was doing to him, when he'd sat in Garrett's office wearing the blue shirt I'd given him for his birthday, and calmly planned her downfall. The video quality was perfect. No grain or distortion to give Marlene any room to claim manipulation. Preston looked directly at the camera as he spoke, and I could see the exhaustion in his eyes that I'd attributed to work stress, but now understood was from fighting poison in his system every day. His hands were steady as he held the papers, though I noticed now how thin they'd become, how his wedding ring seemed loose on his finger. There was no denying it. No claiming fraud or manipulation when Preston's own voice was reading the conditions, when his own hand was signing the documents, when two witnesses sat beside him, nodding their confirmation. Preston had planned everything, documented everything with the thoroughness of someone who knew they had one chance to get it right. Ensured his revenge was as airtight as the code he used to write. Marlene turned to the other man, her head moving slowly like it took effort, perhaps hoping for support or solidarity or even just acknowledgement. But he was already backing toward the door, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound like fingernails on glass. His phone was out, fingers moving quickly across the screen, probably deleting her number from his contacts, erasing text messages, removing any digital trace of their relationship. His face had gone gray beneath his tan, and sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the air conditioning that made the room almost cold. He bumped into a chair in his haste to leave, mumbled something that might have been an apology to no one in particular, and then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silence. She spun toward me next, the movement sharp enough to make her elaborate hairdo wobble, and for a moment her mask completely fell away like makeup running in the rain. The grieving widow persona she'd worn since Preston's death, the successful nurse with her professional competence, the woman who'd inherited millions and planned to spend them on a new life, all of it crumbled like old plaster to reveal someone desperate and cornered. Her eyes were wild now, darting around the room as if looking for an escape route that didn't exist. "Please," she said, the word barely a whisper that cracked in the middle, her voice nothing like the cold authority she'd used when throwing me out. "I'm sorry. I can make this right. You can come back to the house. I'll take care of you. Please." The words tumbled out faster and faster, like water breaking through a dam. She was standing now, her expensive dress wrinkled where she'd been gripping it, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the fabric. But it was far too late for apologies that tasted like ash in the air between us, far too late for promises she'd never intended to keep, far too late for anything except the justice Preston had orchestrated. I looked at her and felt nothing, not satisfaction, not anger, just an empty space where my capacity for caring about her had been. Garrett wasn't finished with the revelations. He pulled out a tablet, swiping across the screen with practiced efficiency, and connected it to the projector. The image changed to security footage from the house, the timestamp showing a week before Preston's death. The familiar kitchen where I'd taught him to cook when he was 12. The black and white footage was grainy, but clear enough to see Marlene crushing extra sleeping pills into Preston's evening tea, using the back of a spoon to grind them into powder. She stirred carefully, methodically, making sure every grain dissolved completely, then tested the temperature with her finger before carrying it to him with a smile. The room gasped collectively, the sound like wind through winter trees. Another video showed her at the pharmacy, using her hospital credentials to pick up prescriptions, far more medication than any single patient would need. She was wearing her scrubs, looking every inch the concerned medical professional, chatting with the pharmacist about the weather while signing for enough sleeping pills to kill someone slowly, carefully, untraceably. The private investigator, a woman in her 40s with the kind of neutral expression that gave nothing away, stood up and began distributing copies of documents to everyone in the room. The papers made a soft, shuffling sound as they passed from hand to hand. Pharmacy records that showed the pattern of purchases, credit card statements with charges at hotels during afternoon shifts, receipts from restaurants she'd never mentioned. Each piece of paper was another nail in the coffin of her deception. painting a picture of betrayal and attempted murder that no one could deny. The coup de grace came when Garrett asked me to read Preston's final letter to Marlene. He handed me the envelope with Preston's handwriting on the front. The letter's slightly shaky, but still recognizably his. The paper inside was cream-colored. Expensive stationery he must have bought specifically for this moment. My hands shook as I opened it, the tremor making the paper rattle, but when I began to speak, my voice was steady as steel. Marlene, if you're hearing this, it means you've shown your true nature, just as I knew you would. Each word fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the room. I loved you once, truly and completely, but that woman disappeared long ago, replaced by someone I don't recognize. Someone capable of poisoning her husband while smiling at him over dinner. Someone who could plan to throw my father out before my body was cold. I'm not angry anymore, just sad that the person I married turned into someone who could do these things. The money was never really yours. It was a test, and you failed. I hope someday you understand that love was worth more than $35 million. You traded everything for nothing. By the time I finished reading, Marlene had collapsed in her chair, sobbing in a way that might have been genuine or might have been one last performance. The nurses from her hospital were already on their phones, probably reporting what they'd witnessed to administrators. The other man had disappeared entirely. The neighbor came over and squeezed my shoulder, tears streaming down her face. Sophie buried her face in Nadine's shoulder, and I heard my daughter whispering that justice had been served. The room began to empty slowly, people filing out in shocked silence or hushed conversations. Soon, only Garrett, Nadine, Sophie, and I remained. And Marlene, still sitting in her chair, staring at nothing, perhaps finally understanding that Preston had beaten her at a game she thought she was playing alone. The fog had lifted outside, revealing crisp October day, sun breaking through clouds like truth, finally coming to light. The 3 days following the will reading passed in a blur of phone calls and legal documents. Marlene tried to contest the will immediately, hiring an expensive lawyer from Boston who took one look at Preston's documentation and told her she had no case. The foundation's lawyers had already frozen the accounts, changed the locks on the house, begun transferring all assets. A detective from the state police came to see me at the motel. A small woman with sharp eyes who'd been assigned to investigate Preston's death, based on evidence revealed during the reading. The detective took my statement over 3 hours, recording everything while I walked her through the timeline of Preston's final months. She showed me additional evidence they'd discovered in just 48 hours. Marlene's computer history revealed searches for dosage information and inheritance laws. She'd been planning this for at least 8 months, according to digital footprints she'd carelessly left behind. There were emails discussing her future with the other man, messages where she complained about being stuck with Preston. The foundation's board contacted me that same day, informing me Preston had left specific instructions for how his assets should be used. The house would become the first Preston house, a residence for elderly individuals who'd been displaced by family members. They offered me the position of resident advisor, someone who could help others navigate trauma of family betrayal. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me that I'd be living in the house Marlene had kicked me out of, but now I'd be helping others who'd suffered the same fate. Nadine and I spent an afternoon going through Preston's office, which Marlene hadn't had time to clear out. We found journals dating back 2 years, filled with Preston's observations about his marriage deteriorating. One entry from 6 months ago made us both cry. I know what she's doing to me. The fatigue, the dizziness, the heart palpitations, they all started after she began giving me those sleeping pills. I've hidden cameras, documented everything. If something happens to me, at least Dad and Nadine will know the truth. Hidden in a locked drawer, we discovered Preston had been corresponding with other victims of inheritance fraud, building a network of people who'd lost everything to greedy relatives. He'd been planning to establish the foundation regardless of his health, But Marlene's actions had accelerated his timeline. There were blueprints for 3 Preston houses, business plans for elderly care services, partnerships with hospitals for free medical care. My son had turned his pain into purpose, his betrayal into a blueprint for helping others. The neighbor visited that evening, bringing a casserole and a box of photographs she'd taken over the years. Pictures of Preston mowing her lawn when her husband was sick, helping fix her fence after a storm, teaching her grandson to ride a bike. She told me things I hadn't known about Marlene's behavior in recent months, how she'd been redecorating obsessively, buying expensive furniture on credit, talking about travel plans that assumed unlimited funds. She'd been spending money she expected to inherit, planning a life that required Preston's death to fund it. A nurse from the hospital came to the motel late one evening, nervous but determined to tell what she knew. Marlene had been stealing medications for months, small amounts that wouldn't be noticed immediately. She'd also been accessing patient records without authorization, studying cases of heart failure and medication interactions. She'd reported suspicions to supervisors twice, but Marlene had talked her way out of it. Now, with everything exposed, the hospital was conducting a full audit that would likely reveal more victims. The media got hold of the story, and suddenly our family tragedy became public entertainment. Reporters called constantly, wanting interviews, offering money for exclusive access to Preston's videos. I refused them all, but someone leaked enough details to fuel dozens of articles. They camped outside the motel, outside Nadine's apartment, outside the house where Marlene was supposed to be packing. The attention was exhausting, invasive, but also served Preston's purpose of ensuring Marlene's complete public humiliation. Garrett called with updates every day, each one revealing another layer of Preston's planning. He'd had Marlene followed by private investigators for months, accumulating evidence of her affair, her spending, her lies. There were recordings of phone conversations where she discussed Preston's life insurance with the other man, videos of them meeting at hotels, evidence she'd been slowly poisoning Preston for longer than we'd thought, starting with small doses 8 months before his death to establish a pattern of illness. A week after the will reading, I stood in the house on Willowbrook Lane for the first time since Marlene had thrown me out. The foundation had sent a crew to pack her belongings, and I was there to identify what belonged to Preston. The ash wood box sat on the mantel where it had always belonged, Preston's photographs arranged inside like he was still there watching. The house felt different without her presence. Lighter somehow, as if the walls themselves were breathing easier. While supervising the packing, I found something that made my blood run cold. In the bathroom medicine cabinet, hidden behind legitimate prescriptions, were 3 bottles of pills with Preston's name, but filled with different medications than labels indicated. The detective would later confirm these were contaminated medications Marlene had been giving him, carefully relabeled to avoid suspicion. She'd been killing him slowly, methodically, with the same attention to detail she brought to her nursing work. Another neighbor from 2 streets over stopped by with information that filled another gap in the timeline. He'd seen Marlene with the other man at a conference 6 months ago. Clearly intimate. Clearly planning something. They'd been overheard discussing timeline and money, though he hadn't understood context then. He'd mentioned it to Preston at a neighborhood barbecue. Preston had gone pale, made an excuse to leave early, and that was the same week he'd started visiting Garrett, started building his elaborate trap. The hospital's investigation revealed that 3 other elderly patients under Marlene's care had died unexpectedly in the past year, all with significant assets, and all having recently changed their wills. While nothing could be proven definitively, patterns were disturbing enough that criminal investigations were being opened. The media exploded with this new information, painting Marlene as a potential serial killer who'd used her position to prey on vulnerable patients. Her nursing license was permanently revoked. That evening, as I sat in Preston's office going through his files, I found a letter addressed to me that Garrett had missed. It wasn't part of legal documents, just a son writing to his father, dated 2 weeks before his death. In it, Preston apologized for not being stronger, for not fighting back directly, for leaving me to deal with aftermath. He wrote about his love for our family, his regret that he'd brought Marlene into our lives, his hope the foundation would help other families avoid similar tragedies. The last line destroyed me. "Dad, I'm not afraid because I know you'll make sure justice is served. You're the strongest man I know, and I'm proud to be your son." I sat there holding that letter, tears falling onto paper that still smelled faintly of Preston's cologne, understanding finally the full weight of what my son had carried alone in his final months. He'd faced his own murder with courage and turned it into a weapon against the woman who'd betrayed him. Marlene was arrested on charges of attempted murder, fraud, and pharmaceutical theft. The bail was set at $2 million, which she couldn't pay since all assets were frozen. Nadine attended the hearing, reporting back that Marlene looked haggard, aged 10 years in 2 weeks, designer clothes replaced with gray jumpsuit. She'd tried to make eye contact with Nadine, perhaps hoping for sympathy from family, but my daughter had simply stared through her like she didn't exist. The other man had fled the state, but not before giving a full statement to police implicating Marlene in everything. He claimed he'd thought she was joking about poisoning, that he'd never believed she'd actually hurt Preston, whether true or just self-preservation. His testimony was damning. He revealed Marlene had talked about Preston's death as inevitable, had made plans for their future that depended on her inheriting millions. He provided text messages where she'd discussed increasing Preston's medication doses. The foundation officially took possession of the house, and I moved in as the first resident of Preston House. It felt strange at first, living in the home where my son had died, where his killer had slept beside him while slowly ending his life. But then other residents began arriving, elderly people who'd been cheated, abandoned, or abused by family members. We formed a strange kind of family, bonded by betrayal, but also by survival, by knowledge that we'd outlasted people who'd tried to destroy us. The last time I saw Marlene was at her sentencing hearing 3 months later. She'd been found guilty on all charges, sentenced to 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 15. As they led her away in handcuffs, she turned to look at me one last time. There was no apology in her eyes, no remorse, just cold rage that she'd been caught, that Preston had outsmarted her. I felt nothing looking back at her. No satisfaction, no anger, just an empty space where my son should have been. 2 years have passed since Preston died, since Marlene's world collapsed in that conference room. $35 million slipped through her fingers like water. I still wake up some mornings expecting to hear his voice from down the hall, still catching myself saving articles about coding breakthroughs to share with him. Grief doesn't leave. It just learns to walk beside you more quietly. The ashwood box sits on my nightstand now, and every morning I touch it gently, a small ritual keeping me connected to the boy who built it with 12-year-old hands. Preston House has become more than any of us imagined. 23 residents call it home now, each with their own story of betrayal and survival. We gather for dinner each night in the dining room Preston and I once painted together, sharing stories and silence equally, understanding each other in ways those who haven't been betrayed by family never could. The walls that heard Preston's labored breathing in his final days now echo with conversation and laughter. Marlene exists now only as a member in the federal prison system, serving consecutive life sentences after Connecticut convicted her for her first husband's murder. She sends letters sometimes, not to me but to Nadine, pages of self-pity and blame that my daughter burns unread. The woman who once wore designer dresses to my son's funeral now wears gray cotton and eats off plastic trays. The hands that crushed poison into Preston's tea now scrub prison toilets. The foundation has helped over 300 elderly victims in 2 years. Each case reminds me why Preston's sacrifice mattered. We've exposed 17 cases of elder abuse, recovered millions in stolen assets, provided safe housing for those with nowhere else to go. Every victory carries Preston's name. Every saved life extends his legacy. Sometimes I imagine telling him about each person we've helped, and I can almost see that crooked smile he'd give when proud but too modest to say so. Sophie decided to become a lawyer because of what happened to Preston. She wants to protect families from predators like Marlene, wants to ensure justice doesn't require someone to die to achieve it. She keeps Preston's picture on her desk at college, calls me every Sunday to share what she's learning. In her, I see Preston's determination, his brilliance, his compassion for the vulnerable. It's a bittersweet gift, watching her become the defender Preston couldn't be for himself. Sometimes I sit in the backyard at sunset, in the chair where Preston and I shared our last beer, where he told me I'd always have a home with him. He kept that promise, just not in the way either of us expected. Through his death, through his planning, through his refusal to let Marlene win, he gave me not just a home, but a purpose. Every person we help, every predator we expose, every vulnerable senior we protect, is Preston keeping his promise. Last week, a young nurse at the hospital asked if I could forgive Marlene. I told her forgiveness isn't mine to give. It belonged to Preston, and he took it with him. What I carry instead is responsibility to ensure his death meant something. Marlene stole my son, but she couldn't steal his legacy. She grabbed for $35 million and ended up with nothing. Preston gave away everything and became eternal. When my time comes, I'll be buried next to Preston, father and son reunited at last. But until then, I have work to do, people to protect, Preston's mission to complete. Every morning I wake up in the house Marlene thought she'd stolen. I remember my son's final gift. He turned our tragedy into triumph, our loss into legacy, our pain into purpose. And somewhere in federal prison, Marlene counts the days she has left, knowing she traded everything for nothing, that she killed the only person who ever truly loved her, and that in the end, Preston won. Thank you for joining me on this journey of justice and redemption. If you've ever faced betrayal from those who should love you most, know that you're not alone. What would you have done in my place? Please share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of triumph over tragedy.